I'd like to get right to it with Daniel Gonzalez. He's one of our colleagues at the Arizona Republic, and he has a story that well is unlike any other story you'll probably ever hear. Daniel, you have an incredibly interesting perspective and a rare experience that we invite you to share.
Thank you. So I took one look at this woman's clothing and I knew there could be a problem. She was wearing a white blouse with pinstripes, some tight blue jeans, and a pair of canvas sneakers. She looked like she was ready for a trip to the shopping mall, not a trek into the desert. It was June 2017, and we were on accompanying a search for a missing migrant. And it was myself and our videographer, David Wallace, and our photographer, Nick Oza. And we were there as part of this project that we were doing to explore what would be the consequences of President Trump's campaign promise to build a wall along the entire US-Mexico border, all 2,000 miles of it. And the woman who looked like she was ready to go shopping, her name was Celine, and the missing migrant was her brother, Carlos Martinez, who was 25 years old. Now, Celine was born in the United States, so she was a US citizen, but her brother had been born in Mexico and had been brought to the United States when he was just 9 months old. And he had lived his entire life in Phoenix. But recently he had been deported for an infraction he had committed when he was a teenager. And now he was trying to get back to his family. But since he had never been able to legalize his status, he had decided to cross the border illegally and cross through the desert. Now, this part of the desert is in southwestern Arizona, and there is a highway that runs along on the Mexican side of the border. And what smugglers will do is they'll pick up migrants in the town of Sasabe, which is on the border, and they'll drive them about 20 miles west, and they'll drop them off in the middle of the desert. Now, what the migrants are trying to do is cross the border illegally and get to the town, this town in Arizona called Ajo. And then from Ajo, there are smugglers waiting for them, and they'll drive them to Phoenix and then to their final destination. Now, in that part of the border, all that's there are some rusted railroad ties that were set up years ago, mostly to block vehicles from getting across the border. They're very easy to get across. You can either just climb over them or underneath them. Now, it might seem, well, this seems like a very easy thing to do to get across, enter the United States illegally. But the reality is there's about 70 miles from the border to the town of Ajo. And what smugglers are trying to do is walk up this ravine between mountains to get there. And this, you have to picture, is one of the most remote and desolate places in the United States, if not the world. It's a place where the temperature in the summer can easily soar up to 120 degrees. As far as you can see, it's just a sea of desert. On the US side is the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. And it's just filled with vicious cactuses. These are cactuses with thorns that can shred your clothing like tissue paper, and they can poke a hole in the sole of your shoe like a nail through butter. Now, we had driven about 2 hours into the heart of the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, and we had parked our car next to what's called a rescue beacon. And these are like metal poles with a shiny object on the top that spins. And they are put there in the middle of the desert in case migrants do get into distress. They can push a button and be rescued. And we decided to park our car there because we knew that when we were coming back, it would be easier to find it. So we started hiking into the desert to the area where the missing migrant had last been seen. And right away, I could see that Celine was going to have a difficult time. She was out of shape and she was breathing heavily and she had to keep stopping to rest. But we kept going and we finally reached the area where the migrant's body had been seen, the area that we were going to search for these remains. And so we were searching, and the Celine had this, I remember her eyes were like a laser focus. She was just absolutely determined to find her brother. And she told us that not knowing what had happened to him and knowing that maybe his remains were out there somewhere was almost worse than knowing that he had died. So we found ourselves kind of participating in this search too, because we wanted to see if we could find the body. We wanted to see if we could help bring some closure to Celine. But we also knew, and I knew, that if we did find the body, it was almost something we were dreading because we knew it could be really horrible. The reason we knew it was horrible is just a week before we had gone to the morgue in Tucson where the remains of migrants, dead migrants, had been found, are brought. And on that day that we were there were the bodies of about 116 migrants being stored in this refrigerated cooler. And a lot of those migrants still hadn't been identified. They didn't know who they were. And while we were there that day, they happened to bring in on these stretchers the bodies of 2 migrants that had been found earlier that day. And I'll never forget what a horrible scene it was. One of the migrants, he didn't have a shirt on, he was wearing jeans, and the medical examiner went through his pockets and he found these little pictures that he had been carrying. And one of the pictures was obviously of his wife, and then there were 4 tiny little pictures, one for each one of his children. And I remember that his skin was just charred black, and it looked like he had been in a horrible fire. And that's what the sun had done from his body being baking out in the Arizona desert. And I'll also never forget the horrible stench that was in that room. It was like acid in our noses, and I remember how it really clung to our clothes. So anyway, we continued to search with Celine, and a couple of hours went by, and we came across this rocky outcropping, and we started seeing the telltale signs of a migrant that had gone into distress and possibly had died. And what happens is when humans start to get heat stroke, their body temperature will soar, and they'll start out of desperation ripping off whatever clothes that they have on. And we saw like a sock here and a backpack there and some underwear and a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. And then all of a sudden Celine bent down and she picked up this single white sneaker that was laying there. And she started looking at it. We were holding our breath, wondering, was this clothing belong to her brother? And could his body possibly be around there somewhere? And she looked at it carefully, and then she looked up at us and she said, no, this is not something that belonged to my brother. So by then, it was starting to get really, really hot. It was the middle of the day. We'd already been searching for several hours, and we knew we had like an hour to 2-hour hike back to our car. So we decided it was best to call off the search. So we started going back, and we got to the car. And by the time we got to the car, Celine was really in bad shape. Her head was pounding. She had a horrible headache. She was dizzy. She was faint. She had stopped sweating. So we got her inside of the car, and we cranked up the air conditioning as high as it would go. And we gave her some ice water that we had stored and some salty snacks and some ibuprofen. And after about a half an hour, she started feeling better, to our relief. So we ended up, after that, driving back to Phoenix. Now, about a month later, I got a text message from Celine, and it said that some migrants had come across a body in the desert, and they had carried it all the way back into Mexico and left it there. And now the Mexican authorities were conducting DNA tests to see if that body belonged to Celine's brother. But they told her it was going to take a while for those tests to get the results back from the test. Now, it's been about 3 years since that search happened, and the border wall is back in the news again. President Trump is campaigning for president, and he's boasting on the campaign trail that his administration has built about 300 miles of additional fencing. And this new fencing that's going up along the border is about 30 feet high. And some of that fencing is being built in the exact spot where Celine's brother crossed. So now it's much more difficult to cross in that area. Now, some people might say, well, the fence is working. It's saving lives because people can't cross there anymore. But the reality is a lot more complex because a fence and a wall is not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. Because the reality is a lot more difficult. The reality is that the wall doesn't address the root causes of migration. It doesn't address the extreme poverty that exists in Mexico and other countries in Latin America, the corruption, the cartel violence, the insecurity, the things that drive people to migrate, to leave their homes. And it also doesn't address the opportunities that exist in our country, and the jobs that many Americans no longer want to do, like the farm workers who pick our food, or the people who cook our food in restaurants, or the people who clean our toilets in hotel rooms. And it also doesn't address our broken immigration system that often forces people to come illegally rather than legally. Now, in 2018, our project called The Wall won the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the reporters, the journalists who got to go to New York to receive the award. And standing on the stage at Columbia University was one of the highlights of my journalism career. But that's not why we do this work. We don't do this work to win awards. We do this work to explain to the public what the consequences are of building a border wall. And here's what some of those consequences are. The statistics show that in the last 20 years, around 11,000 migrants have died in the desert. More than 3,000 of those migrants have died in Arizona alone. And just this year, the bodies of 120 migrants have been found. And what that suggests is that migrants are being pushed to cross in ever more risky and deadly areas. Now, Celine's brother, his goal was to come back to Phoenix. And about 2 months after I got that first text message from Celine, that's about how long it took for those DNA tests to come back. And those DNA tests ended up verifying that those remains that were found were indeed Celine's brother. And his goal was to come back to Phoenix one day and be reunited with his family. But that never happened. And what ended up happening was that Celine brought his ashes back to Phoenix in a wooden box. Thank you.